Hey, Joe Gilder here. Welcome to a very special training, something I'm super excited about. I'm actually doing this live on YouTube, streaming this whole shebang. I've got all sorts of things running at once, and we're going to hope that it doesn't crash, but I don't think it will. I think we're going to be in good shape. What I've got planned for you today is we're going to talk about the keys to a great vocal mix. I've been a singer Hey, stop that. I've been a singer my whole life, and I'm a pretty good singer, and I'm very picky when it comes to vocals. And I've learned over the years of recording a lot of myself singing and mixing all of that, mixing for clients, mixing for other people, mixing inside of dueling mixes and other such things. I've learned a lot of tricks and a lot of ways to get a good vocal. And I'm pretty picky when it comes to vocals, so I don't usually settle for bad vocal mixes. Have I produced bad vocal mixes before? You betcha. But having done this hundreds of times, I've gotten to a point where I can pretty confidently take, if it's a good recording, I can take that and get that to work in the mix. And I want that for you. So that's why I'm doing this training. Not to say, hey, look at me, I can get a good vocal mix. But to say, hey, here are some of the things that I've learned. Maybe I can save you some time and all the mistakes that I've made and show you some kind of go-to consistent strategies that work, whatever platform you're using, whatever system you're using to mix, some strategies that work and actually make the vocal sound good. Does that sound like a plan? Does that sound like something you want to be a part of? Cool. So stick around. This is going to be in depth. We're going to dive in. I'm going to open up sessions and do stuff. Not just going to be talking, but we'll go back and forth. And then I'll give you an opportunity at the end to dive in deeper with some other stuff if you want to go even further down the rabbit hole with me. But otherwise, this video should be packed full of goodness for you. So I'm super glad you're here. If you see me looking over to the left, there's a live chat going on. And I just want to make sure if things go down and aren't working, I can see it over here. But I will take questions as we go through. I'll pause for those. And in the future, if you're watching this video on YouTube and you have a question, leave a comment. I check those and reply to just about all of them at this point. So I'm happy to answer any questions if I don't explain something super well. Okay? So those of you in the chat, let me know that you're ready to go. Let me know you're ready. If you're not ready, we're not going to do this. We'll end it now. It'll be the shortest webinar ever. There's a lag. I'm going to assume you're going to tell me that you're ready and we're going to get going. Okay. So the name of this video, the name of this little mini course right now is called The Keys to a Great Vocal Mix. And the first thing, you knew if I'm wearing the shirt, the first step to all of this is going to be none of what I'm going to talk about for the next hour, hour and a half, however long this takes. None of what I'm going to say is going to make any difference if you don't first do this thing right here, GIRATS. I happen to be wearing the shirt because I'm a total nerd, and the letters are too high. Like it's a horribly done shirt, but I wore it because it makes a point that the vocal performance and recording itself has to be good. It doesn't have to be the best in the world, but you can't expect to get an amazing vocal mix if you don't have an amazing vocal recording, okay? That's about as much as we're going to talk about recording here because this is a vocal mixing training. Okay, I'm not going to talk, I'll talk occasionally about recording, but for the most part, this is about mixing. So we have to all, raise your hand and say, I agree that I have to get it right at the source, that nothing I'm going to teach you tonight is going to help you fix a really bad sounding vocal. Or if it's a really bad singer, nothing I'm going to show you tonight is going to make that person suddenly sound amazing. It's not like you're missing this one EQ curve that will suddenly take a hideous vocal and make it sound amazing, okay? I've said that so many times, but I would be remiss if I didn't say it tonight before we kick things off. If you want some more training on recording vocals, I created a course a while back. A lot of people like. It's called Recording Killer Vocals. You can go look that up if you want to dive into the vocal recording stuff, okay? Okay. All right, so let's get into the mixing. That's what you're here for. And everyone's saying, great. How do you get one of these shirts? I believe the link is homestudiocorner.com/swag. I think that's it. I think that's the link. And they're expensive. I bought one for myself, and I bought two, one of these and one that says Home Studio Corner, and I think those are the only sales that have ever been made, other than like 2 or 3. One-off t-shirts are expensive. Anyway, let's get up. Okay, so the first thing we're going to start with, I'm going to talk about EQ. I'm going to talk about compression. I'm going to talk about how to get the vocals to sit in the mix. I'm going to talk about vocal automation. I'm going to talk about different ways to approach all of those things I just said. I'm going to talk about effects. How are we going to use effects? How do we set those up? What are the different ways to do that? What are all the different ways to use things like compression and EQ? And what are some go-to settings that I use and approaches that I take when it comes to those? So that's all well and good, and that's all the meat of what we're going to talk about, and it's all really important. But first, before we get into that, you got to realize this is true of anything you're mixing, especially like bass and drums. The level, where the fader is in the session, is by far, it's not the most important thing. I'll give you that. It's not the most important thing. But if you've got the level wrong, you're going to spend all your time trying to get the compressor to do what you should have been doing with the fader, okay? By the nature of a vocal, it's going to be pretty dynamic, and you're going to have to probably use something like compression to tame the big variance in volume. But if you've got the overall vocal level that's too hot, you're going to overcompress to try to get it down. If it's too low, you're going to try to do some crazy overcompression and then increase the gain on that to get it to be louder. You don't want to do either of those. So make sure you've got a good, not always. I try to always start my mixes with a good static mix, where I'm just messing with faders and pan knobs, and that's it. If that takes me 5 minutes, great. If it takes me an hour, fine. It's worth it, because if you can get to a point where there are plenty of problems, but you're kind of bobbing your head to the mix and you haven't put an EQ on there yet, you're moving in the right direction, and everything else gets a lot easier. So don't be so quick to use this next little trick I'm going to show you that you skip over getting a good balance. I have so many people send me mixes to critique, and they'll include notes like, Joe, I really tried this and this and this and this and this on the vocal, and I'm still hearing this and this, and it's a problem, and I just can't. I listen to the mix, and the drums are 10 times louder than everything else in the mix, and I can't hear the bass at all. And the vocal doesn't even matter because the entire rest of the mix is so out of balance. Now, can that be subjective? Yeah, of course it's subjective, but it's also, there are some generally accepted ranges in which to have the drums and the bass and the guitars. They all need to be in balance. Back in the day, when they wore like white coats in the studio and had far fewer channels to work with, a lot of times they called them balance engineers, because their job was to balance the sounds coming in before they got recorded down to like a single track mono recording. They didn't get to mix it later. They mixed it while the musicians were out there performing, and that was it. One chance, one take. I kind of want to do that one day. But I love the idea of being called a balance engineer. It's pretty cool. Okay, so level. Get the level right, okay? All right, we're going to first jump into probably the thing I do most, or this whole series we're going to go through, and I'll have these notes available to you so you can have them, you can tape them on your wall to help you if you get stuck or you forget something I said, and we'll refer back to this. But EQ is everything I'm going to show you tonight is going to be in roughly the order that I do it when I mix a vocal. Now, there aren't any hard and fast rules, but I tend to EQ first before I compress, but there are examples where I don't do that, but this is kind of roughly the order that I go through when I'm thinking through working on a vocal. So let's talk about EQ. I'm going to show you first my go-to moves with an EQ, and then we'll talk about a couple other things dealing with room resonance and things like that. So why do you keep jumping up? Now you're giving away all my secrets. All right, let's do this. Doodle-a-doo. Now stay there, little turd. Okay. So there are some go-to things that I do when working on a vocal. Let's take a break. I've been talking for too long already. Let me open up this session real quick. So this is a session. Oh, look at that. It pops up real big. This is an EP that I produced earlier this year for Frankie Barranco. You've probably heard it if you followed me. I've used this stuff in a couple different videos. Or maybe if you haven't streamed this, ignore me for a minute. Go to Spotify or iTunes and add this to your library and sit down and listen to it. It's a beautiful set of music. For real. But let's take a listen to, this is what was playing in like the intro music if you were here early. Let me just get you a little bit of listen as to what this song sounds like, and then we'll go in and we'll start doing basically everything we talk about. I'm going to do a little bit of it and show you examples of it in this mix that I have in front of me. Okay? All right, here's a quick listen.
it's not fine, it'll never be. So stop saying time can ever comfort me.
Beautiful song. That's all you get to hear for now. Definitely go check it out. So what we have here is an instrumental mix. I just muted all the vocals, instrumental mix, and then these are just the raw. So that's the finished instrumental mix, and these are the raw vocals here in yellow, okay? And that's what we're going to be dialing into over the course of this video. I've got another song I might pull in to show you a couple things, but this will be the main one because who wants to listen to me all the time? Frankie's a much better singer. Okay, so the first go-to move, and we're talking about EQ. Let me pull in an EQ. Now, if you don't use Studio One, hopefully you know this by now. It doesn't matter what software you use. You can get good results, okay? That is the truth. I'm just spitting the truth out here. So I will be using this stock EQ, the Pro EQ that comes with Studio One. If you use Pro Tools, if you use Logic, they all have EQs, and they all look kind of like this. So you can figure out what I'm doing. If it's not exactly the same, don't freak out. You're big boys and girls. You can figure this out if it's not the exact same thing. The vocal here that you see, someone's asking, is it comped? Yes, that is the kind of final comped vocal. We didn't really do comps. We just recorded it until we got a good take, and then we punched in a few spots. But this is the raw vocal otherwise. And it's been tuned, but anyway, y'all are distracting me. Okay, so the first thing, you've probably heard this before, high pass filter is kind of a go-to for me, just about any vocal. What it does, if you've never used a high pass filter before, it rolls off all the low frequencies below a certain point with a gentle slope. If you overdo it, it sounds like this.
I've been broken.
So you don't want to overdo it, but you can, it does get rid of that kind of low end rumble. I used to say something that I completely don't believe anymore. I used to say you should put a high pass filter on everything, and except for kick drum and bass guitar in your mix. I don't believe that's true anymore. In general, unless the vocal has an obvious like low end rumble to it, then I don't think you necessarily have to use a high pass filter. I usually end up throwing one on there. Probably half the time it's just kind of a habit, but it's usually down low just in case there's air conditioner rumble. We're in home studios, right? There's always some sort of noise that's happening, and as you add in things like compression, that can bring up that noise, so it's nice to just get rid of it right out of the gate. So a high pass filter is kind of a go-to boring part of this EQ move. One of the bigger things I do when I EQ a vocal is I usually cut some sort of mid-range. Almost always, with certain exceptions, you tend to record the vocal fairly close to the microphone, and that gives you warmth, but a lot of times it can give you too much warmth or a little too much mid-range. So on this vocal, let's just take a listen.
Since you left,
Not too bad. Let's go over here.
oh,
So pretty voice, but she's kind of got this soft Lee Nash kind of voice, right? So we want it to be nice and bright. We don't want it to be dull. We also don't want it to be super harsh and shrill. So usually there's something down in this lower mid-range that we can kind of go find that's just not helping things. There's usually one frequency that kind of is in the sort of range that you can take care of. So let's see.
oh,
So by default, I've just boosted around 320. Let's just drag it around, see if we can find something annoying.
I am not okay, but I wouldn't have it any other way.
So it's kind of that note she's singing, ooh, right in there. It's just a little annoying. So I'll go in and just do a little bit of a cut there, and there's this smoothness that happens. Now, the thing you have to worry about and be aware of is when you take away mid-range, there's always the danger of boosting the lows and boosting the highs, or getting that smiley curve that you hear about. You know, you grew up and your dad had this big stereo and he had all the lows boosted and all the highs boosted and the mid-range is cut. And you think it sounds good, but go listen to your favorite record. It does not sound like that. It doesn't have all the mid-range cut out and only lows and highs. That's bad. Doesn't sound good. You think it sounds good, but then you listen more intently and you realize, ooh, that's hard to listen to. So that's not what I'm advocating here. But because of vocal, and just about every instrument in your mix they all have fundamental frequencies in the same like block of frequencies. We can EQ from 20 hertz up to 20 kilohertz, but really the bulk of the tone and the fundamental frequencies of what we're working on are in this range right here. 150 to 500 or so. There's a lot going on there. And if you don't cut some of that out, you end up with the muddy mix that we all deal with a lot when we're working on we're first getting into mixing. Then if you overcompensate and you end up with a harsh mix because you took too much of the mid-range out. So try to find the middle ground, but let's just see what works on this vocal.
Oh, I am not okay.
So if I just cut that one,
But
let's just cut it down a little bit.
oh, I am not okay.
Here it is without the EQ.
Oh,
It's a little muddy, a little kind of wah-wah. Now with the EQ, sounds a little smoother.
I
Could probably do a little bit more.
I am not okay.
Okay, so if you can't hear that, this is live, it's streaming. You may not be able to hear everything I'm doing super, super well, but just a little bit of that is now down. You still hear it. I don't want to get rid of it because that's the warmth of her voice. That's part of what makes it sound so beautiful. But if we don't take care of a little bit of that mid-range, it's going to build up and it's going to interfere with everything else in the mix, especially when you hear everything together, which is not going to work just yet. But you can hear how that range of that vocal is going to interfere with the acoustic guitars, the electric guitars, the bass, snare drum, kick drum a little bit, any toms that come in. So we want to try to not have there be too much there. Someone just said, I've heard that 100 times and you just made it make sense. Good. We're on to the right, off to the right, off to the races, on the right track. That's what I was trying to say. I don't know why I say that. I've never been to a horse race once in my life. Okay. So that's the high-pass filter. That's the mid-cut to get rid of the mud. The other thing that's going to happen, I do a lot of subtractive EQ, okay? I'm not saying it's the best, but it's the best. Not really. For me, there's two ways to use EQ. An EQ like this, that is just a very basic bread-and-butter, plain old EQ that doesn't have much of a sound to it. It's great for removing unwanted frequencies. You just saw me do that. We're going to do it again in the upper mid-range to see if there's any harshness up there. So let's do that. Let's go up here to where she's singing really loud.
am not okay, but I wouldn't have it any other way. Without this pain, how would I know?
Okay, so it's very pretty. It's very nice.
There is darkness.
But it's got a hang on. Where was I?
Without this pain, how would I know?
There's a little bit of harshness that when she sings, kind of this sort of frequency that comes out, and everybody's got it. Every singer has it. So usually I found there's almost never a vocalist that couldn't help from a little bit of upper mid-range cut. Maybe a narrow thing, maybe not, but there's usually some sort of harshness up there that can be taken care of now, because once we compress, it's going to take... Compression takes anything that's annoying and emphasizes it. Compression is like a 7-year-old. They love to annoy you. I love my kid. He's annoying just like his daddy. But they like to do things that they know are going to bother you. A compressor is the same way. Stop it. It's going to take the annoying parts of the song, of the vocal, and while it's doing its compression thing, and we'll get on compression in just a second, it's going to bring out all the bad stuff, along with bringing in the good stuff. So if we can EQ some of the bad stuff out a little bit to minimize that from happening, when you slap that compressor on there, suddenly, it's nice and delightful. Okay, so let's go look at the upper mids and see what we got up there. I'll take this band, zoom in a little bit. We'll look around like the 3K range, 2 to 4K, see if we can find something nasty.
Without this pain, how would I know?
Ugh. I hear that a lot in it just this is at 3.15K. There's always something, and you notice it kind of just rings out.
Without this pain.
It's not really related to any note that she's singing. It's just there. Could be the room. She recorded this in that room over there. It's not the best room in the world. We'll talk about that in a second. Or it could just be the nature of her voice, the way the waves resonate inside her nasal cavity, which is so weird to think about that that's happening. But it could be something like that, or it could be the microphone could have a little resonance there. There's all sorts of things it could be. I don't care what it is. I just want to find it and get rid of it. So we found it. It's super annoying sounding.
Without this pain.
Okay, let's cut it pretty dramatically. A big narrow cut.
without this pain.
Do you hear how much smoother her voice sounded? The thing I showed you before with the mid-range, it was a nominal difference. This is really obvious. You can hear her voice sounds so much smoother. It sounds like somebody ran it through some tubes or whatever. It's warm. It's all those words that we like to use, but it's because we got rid of that harsh frequency that was there. Here it is before.
Without this pain.
Here it is after.
Without this pain.
Okay, it was a little more obvious when we had it boosted.
Without this pain.
But that little sharp little frequency is just cutting through.
Without this pain.
And her voice sounds so much smoother. And that's without doing any sort of de-essing. It's not taking care of the sibilance in her voice. We may still need to do that. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. But it does take care of like this ringing that was there that was causing a little bit of resonance. Now, if you got any questions, I'm about to be done with a little bit of the EQ talk. Go ahead and post those and I'll answer them in a second. And I will do a bypass in just a second. But the thing to keep in mind, and this is something I've not explained well, and I apologize, but I'm explaining it now, so this will make up for all the times I didn't explain it well. There's always going to be, when you boost frequencies like I just did, I boosted it and I swept it around to see what was bad. And the problem with that is you got to be careful because everything sounds bad when you boost it like that. Let me show you.
Without this pain, how would I know?
I mean, not one of those frequencies was pleasant when I boosted it, but even then you could notice there were some, even though I kept the volume at the same level, some of those frequencies jumped out more than others. So when you boost, if you're going to do this, don't take the very first frequency you hear and start cutting it. Sweep it around all the way up and down if you have to, and you'll notice there are some that are more bothersome than others. But the first thing you need to do is listen to the vocal and decide, okay, what am I listening for? What don't I like? I heard a little bit of harshness on some of the notes she was singing, so I know harshness is usually 1K to 5K or maybe even higher. So that's probably where I'm going to look. So I boost down here at 800 hertz and I start sweeping up, see what I discover.
Without this pain, how would I know?
So there's plenty between like 1500 and 3K, plenty of junk in there that you could probably go get. There could possibly be a different frequency than what I used that would give me an even better result, but there's something there, and even just cutting one of them, there may not be a right answer here, but cutting one of them will make it sound smoother. Somebody was asking for a bypass, so I'll bypass all the EQ, and then we'll slap it back in so you can hear. We've only done a high pass that's not really doing anything, mid cut, and upper mid, more of a notch. Here's before, and then I'll just click the EQ on and play it again.
Without this pain, without this pain.
That's it. If I were to play that for you in like an A/B, and I hate A/B tests. Don't care about A/B test. If someone's going to show you an A/B test, just say, get out of here, man. I don't want no A/B test. But because I think they're super biased and they don't really help anything, and people like to nerd out over them, and they don't really help you make better music. But if I were to A/B that before and after and say, what's different? You might say, oh, one was recorded with a tube mic and one was recorded with a brighter condenser, or one was run through a sweet compressor and one wasn't. You don't tend to think, oh yeah, that's two cuts with an EQ. That's just not terribly exciting, right? Nobody thinks, oh, I'm so excited about the EQ cuts that I just did. We get excited when we like slam something with a compressor and it sounds amazing, and rightly so. But this is the work of a good mix. Imagine doing this over the course of an entire mix where you're just taking things that are problematic and you're removing them and you're left with awesomeness. Now, is there a place to do boosts? Absolutely. I've started doing them more the last few years than I used to. I used to almost only cut, but there are places to boost. But for me, it's always a matter of fixing problems first, and then if I need to enhance good stuff, I will. So the final thing I want to show you is there's always the option of boosting the top end. Her voice and this microphone combination is pretty bright already, but I'll show that to you. For me, you can either use a shelf, which looks like this, where it's just boosting everything above a frequency pretty fairly evenly. Or you can do, this is something a buddy of mine showed me years ago. You could take just a regular peak and make it pretty wide and then just boost up here at like 20 kilohertz. So then it's kind of this natural sloping up in the high range. It doesn't really matter either way. Try whichever one you think works and sounds good. But here's what that sounds like on her voice if we want some of that air and crispiness up top.
Without this pain, how would I know?
Now, in this mix, I'm not going to boost it. I just wanted you to hear it. You hear that crispiness. You can hear some of the detail in her voice. But if we boosted that and then compressed it, it would be just overly harsh. We'd be slamming a de-esser. There's already a bit of sibilance here to deal with. I don't feel any sort of movement of the spirit to boost the high frequencies here. I don't think it's going to help. One thing to keep in mind as well, and I was just going back and forth with Graham Cochran today and a few times last week about this very thing. Do not, listen to me, listen, pay attention, look at me. Do not fall in love with the high boost. It is so easy to do, especially if you've got a sweet SSL channel with that beautiful high frequency shelf that you just boost and it makes everything sound nice and bright and beautiful without being harsh. Go listen, again, I implore you, go listen to your favorite records and you'll notice, oh, wow, this is a pretty dark sound. Those vocals are fairly dark. None of them have this super bright, shimmering top end that we think we like. Now, it's hard because you initially hear the shimmery top end and you think, well, hey, that's better. But like I said before, if you listen overall, you realize that brightness is kind of fatiguing to your ears, and it's also not what you hear on your favorite records. They still manage to sound good and full and have brightness, but they're not super bright. So I'm really bad at doing references when I mix, but it's a worthwhile endeavor to really critically listen to stuff and to not just think, I'm going to boost all the highs because dadgummit, I've got an SSL and I'm going to do it. You may end up with a really harsh mix that nobody wants to listen to. Okay? Let's see if we got any questions over here. Gary, what's up, Gary Fox? Says, how many cuts might you end up making there? 4, 6? If there are that many bad spots, should you try a new recording with a different mic and EQ going in? I don't do a lot of EQ going in. I'll do a little bit. Like on my ADL 700, it's a nice preamp with a nice EQ, but it's usually wider stuff. I'm not really correcting. They don't usually have like really narrow settings on them anyway. But yeah, in general, if I see myself with like 4 or 6 different notches in one spot, something's gone wrong elsewhere. Maybe I rolled off too much low end and that's what's making it sound harsh, not that I need to remove more of the mid-range frequencies. It could be you need to re-record. It could be that you just need to find the one frequency that's the worst and then leave the rest. You're probably over-mixing it at some point. And it's easy to do. I do it still to this day. I might pull up a mix and you'll see a ton of EQ in one spot. And at some point I'll realize it and say, you dummy, and I'll take all the EQ off and it'll sound better. And then I'll do 1 or 2 moves and be done with it. So for me, on average, ignoring the high-pass filter, it's probably 2 to 3 EQ moves on the vocal. And then I'll at this stage, and then I'll EQ, or then I'll compress it, do whatever else needs to be done, and then I may throw another EQ at the end of the chain to kind of smooth out and do overall shaping towards the end of the mix, once all the other stuff has happened to the vocal. That's fairly common. But yeah, if I find myself doing tons and tons of EQ moves, something else is wrong. Joe, do you know how you can turn off a row of effects in Studio One? I don't think you can. You can turn off everything. But I know Pro Tools does that thing where you can turn off a row. I'll be honest, I never do that. Don't think it's terribly helpful because a lot of plugins are going to add some volume, so you're not really getting a good A, B, really. I mean, you should. You should mix everything and have the volume coming out be roughly the same as the volume coming in. But like this vocal, she's probably a little bit louder now that we've cut a few frequencies. I'm not going to go boost the output of the EQ to match that. I just don't care enough. With compression, I do more because I'm doing more with the compressor. But anyway, do you know, or how can you, that was the same question I just answered. In this day and age, it really doesn't matter what DAW you're using. The best one is the one you are comfortable with. Steve Ronsonet, I completely agree with you. All right. Now I mentioned this earlier, and this is actually a good example. There's another thing that I do with EQ, and something to be aware of. If it's your own recording or someone else, and it's not recorded in a really nice facility, or even if it is, you got to remember there's no such thing as a perfect room. Every room, even if it has no parallel walls and is treated, Bob, what's the dude's name? Carl Tatz designed it, and you spent $40,000 on the room. Great. Still not a perfect room. That's just not possible. So what that means is there are things that can happen called room resonance, or I guess that's what it's called, where there are certain frequencies that are just amplified in the room. It's as if your room has like a graphic EQ, and certain frequencies get cut and certain frequencies get boosted. The ones that get cut are harder to deal with, but for me, I've noticed a lot. There are recordings where I'll hear some kind of either mid-range or upper mid-range problem in the vocal, and I'll do a boost, and I'll find a frequency that's just kind of resonating regardless of what he or she is singing. And to me, that's an indication it's not the person singing, it's the environment she's in, most likely. It's probably a frequency in that room that's resonating. Sometimes it's fine, you can leave it alone. Sometimes it helps to take it out. Let's see if we can find one on her voice. I'm sure there are some there.
Without this pain, how would I know that this broken world was never meant to be my home? Without this pain, how would I know that this broken world was never meant to be my...
I think we already found it. I think it was this one right here.
Without this pain.
So you hear how it's just kind of, no matter what note she's singing, that same little whistle is happening. And a lot of times it does sound like a whistle, like someone's sitting there being annoying in the room going the same note the entire time. If you hear that when you're searching for something, it's probably like a room resonance thing. And if you just do a really narrow notch on it, it takes care of it. You really don't hear it anymore. It just gets rid of it, kind of like a snare drum. If a snare drum is ringing, goo, and you don't want that much ring, you just got to go find that one specific frequency and cut it really narrow, and it gets rid of it. There may be a harmonic of that you have to also go cut if it's there. But if you get the main one and just cut it down, you can get rid of it entirely. You can cut it down to where it's not ringing as loudly. Same idea here. There's just a certain frequency. It's like a snare drum doesn't change notes, right? It's going to be goo, goo, goo. Your room also doesn't change notes. It just has certain notes that it hates. This room I'm in right now, I know it's got some weirdness at about 2.8K that will resonate. And I have to be careful not to take too much of that out in my mixes because it's not actually in my mixes. It's usually in this room as I'm listening. So things to think about. All right. That's enough about EQ. We got any more EQ questions in the live chat? Sounds like Herbert from Family Guy. I do a mean Herbert impression one day. But I don't think we're going to do that today. See? How do I record a voice that has a strong low-mid buildup? When I do cut, it sounds weird, and when I stand further away for less proximity, it sounds boxy. Not going to talk about recording much, but I will answer that. For a few years, I thought if I backed away from the mic, it would be less boomy and life would be good. Nope, it got less boomy, it wasn't as warm, and then there was more sibilance for some reason. I found, for me, my voice, my mouth with my gaff and my teeth, getting closer to the microphone yields me the best overall sound. The sibilance isn't quite as bad. There's plenty of warmth there. It's not too boomy, and I can always do a little bit of EQ like I showed here to take care of it. Any other EQ questions? I have another career option. I'm going to regret that. All right, great. Let's keep moving. Y'all are fun. All right, we're going to talk about compression now. Now, real quickly, commercial. I've got 2 courses that I made, and I've made a few versions of them now, called Understanding EQ and Understanding Compression. I dive into this stuff super in-depth, not just about vocals, but drums, bass, guitars, everything, and really dive into those. So if you're still scratching your head a little bit when you watch this as to what I'm doing with EQ, or especially with compression, what are all these knobs doing? I'll explain it a little bit, but they're really explained the best in those 2 courses. You can check them out at understandingeq.com, understandingcompression.com. Check them out. Okay, so let's talk about compression on the vocals. Why would we compress a vocal? There are 2 reasons that come to mind. There may be more in my notes as I scroll down. But for me, the reason we compress a vocal is, 1, to just control the volume. The vocalist, you can just look at her voice here. She's all over the place volume-wise, and she's a great singer. It's just the nature of the beast. If we add compression, it's going to turn down those loud parts, and then we can just turn up the overall volume. So now she's just a more consistent volume overall. That's the general boring answer for what a compressor does, and one of the reasons we use it for a vocal. The bigger reason, though, for me, is there's a tone that happens from a compressed vocal. Just like you can't get a great rock mix. That's not fair. Most great rock mixes involve compressing the snare drum, right? It does something that you just don't get from a raw recording of a snare. That compression does something that we're used to hearing in a rock mix. Same thing with most vocals that you hear. With most genres, you're used to hearing a compressed vocal sound. That's what you're used to hearing. And there's lots of good things that happen from compression that I really like. It makes it sound a little more strained in a good way. If you have too much compression, it can sound like you're choking the singer. That's a bad thing. It evens out the volume in a way that's really interesting. Like, it brings up things like breath noise, the singer taking a breath before a phrase. That can be kind of cool and artistic. It can bring up small little sounds in the throat that you wouldn't hear otherwise, but like if you're singing the beginning of a note and you go, I was gonna sing a snote, and that little thing that happens, it's just some artists do that, and it's interesting. And you can't hear it in a big, huge mix, but if you compress it, it starts to come out a little more, and you hear this. That's a horrible example. I feel like I need to sing like Britney Spears, but that's not the point I was trying to make. So that's what compression does. That's why we use it. Those are the two main reasons we use it, and that's kind of what it sounds like. You'll hear more of that in a second. What are the things, what's the downside of compression? I alluded to this earlier. Room noise. If you're recording in a room like this one, you can probably hear, even with the gate that's on my mic right now, you can probably hear some of the room, right? It's not a well-treated room, but I don't do much vocal recording in here. If I did, and then I went to compress, well, compression does what? It turns down loud things, and in doing so, turns up quiet things. Well, that means the room sound is going to be turned up. So the good answer is to record a really dry-sounding vocal so you don't have the room sound. The more difficult answer, if the room sound is there, then you're not allowed to compress as much if you don't like the sound of the room that's coming up with the compression. So things to think about. It also brings up breath sounds, mouth noise, and sibilance. So if they're just sitting there like between takes and you hear that sound of their mouth, it's going to be a lot louder, because if there's a really aggressive compressor on there, you may have to go edit some of that stuff out. Breath sounds sometimes sound cool being loud. If you're a Muse fan, it sounds like he's gasping for his life between every phrase. He's like, it's kind of cool. I like it. But if you start listening to it, it makes you feel like you're going crazy because it's really, really loud. Part of it's just the performance. Part of it is the compression also lets that come through really loud. And then sibilance. I mentioned this before. The S's and T's in our voice, if it's at a good sounding level, when you compress it, a lot of times what happens is it becomes too much. Everything else about the vocal might sound amazing, but that sibilance is coming through too loudly. So we use things like de-essers, which is a form of compression to take care of that. But it is an artifact of compression that sometimes maybe just ease up on the compressor and that sibilance won't be so bad. Maybe you don't need to compress as aggressively as you have. Can compression make you lose dynamics? Yes and no. It can, in the sense that it is literally changing the dynamic of the vocal, but it makes it in a more, to me, more acceptable range. So if I'm singing like this and then I'm singing like this, like, you don't want that to be such a loud change in volume that it hurts your ears and makes you jump. You want to hear those that maybe one just a little bit louder than the other, but you can tell that I'm singing much louder than the other just by the tone of the voice and the way it sounds and the timbre and all that. But you don't necessarily, I don't have to have a huge volume jump for you to hear the intensity jump. That's what people talk about. The intensity is there. Compression just handles a volume. We really, if we're honest, want that vocal to sit just the same volume the entire time and the intensity to go up and down. Well, you can do that. The intensity changes with the performance, then just use a compressor to slap it into place and make it not have tons of volume changes. All right, I don't want to get too bogged down. I want to go through this because I don't want you to be bored and be here forever. Let's talk about some vocal compression approaches. First, volume control. You can use a compressor in the way you learned for the first time when you first learned what a compressor does. It's volume control, right? It turns down loud things. So you can do that, and I do that a lot with vocals to kind of just first approach to a vocal, when I first hear that it's pretty dynamic, I'll slap a really aggressive compressor on there that will take care of the loudest peaks so that they're no longer loud. This gets back to that level thing that I said before, getting the vocal at a good level as the first step of your vocal mix, and then you may find that the average level is great, but there are notes that are jumping out and are annoying. The beauty of doing digital recording in a digital world, you can just look and see. Like this line right here is a lot louder. What does she sing there?
There is darkness.
So dark is a lot louder than everything else. There is darkness. That kind of thing. Not really. It doesn't sound that bad, but in the mix, what really ends up happening is we hear dark. We don't really hear there is or ness. We kind of hear dark. So we can automate that, and we'll talk about automation later, but I am lazy. Remember this. Joe Gilder is lazy. If I can fix the problem with compression with a few knobs and not have to sit there and ride the volume fader for 4 minutes, which turns into 40 minutes, I'm always going to pick that option. So let's slap a compressor on this and go through the settings that I like to use if I'm just going to control volume. So you could use a limiter. I've done that before. There's not as much control depending on the limiter that you're using, and sometimes they're pretty processor intensive. So a lot of times I just like to use a compressor. But here are like my volume control go-to settings for compression. I like to go with a fast attack, usually about 1 millisecond. Depending on the compressor, it can sound weird any faster than that. Pretty quick release, so 10 milliseconds. A high ratio, so I'll just jack up the ratio to where it's a little more like a limiter, get rid of that knee setting, and then the threshold will stay pretty high as well. So again, I'm just trying to get the peaks. It's not going to really change the tone of the vocal at all. I just want to catch those peaks and tell her to be a little quieter on those sections. So let's hit play and let's see what the compressor's doing. Right here, this little bar right there shows how much compression is happening, the gain reduction that's there. So here we go.
There is darkness.
Perfect. I just totally guessed, and that worked really well. It brought down darkness by about 7 dB. Maybe a little bit much. We can bring the ratio down, threshold up a little bit.
There is darkness. There is darkness.
Did the job quite well. Without the compressor, it sounds like this.
There is darkness.
With the compressor,
there is darkness.
It feels like someone's just hanging on to darkness and pulling it down a little bit. Might be a little much. I'll just bring the threshold up just a smidge.
There is darkness.
But that works really well. And the overall, like when I do this, I usually don't do any makeup gain. It's just I've set the level of the vocal to a place that feels good in the overall mix.
There is darkness on the brightest day. And no, there's beauty here since black cloud remains.
So all those quieter parts don't get touched by the compressor. It's just getting those peaks. Now, someone asked a question in the chat, and it's a very good question. How many compressors should you use on a vocal? Just as many as you need. If you have a vocal that's exhibiting this kind of, it has peaks that are jumping out, and you just know from the song, you've heard the song before, you recorded it, you know there are certain notes that are just jumping out all the time, then this is a good idea to put this compressor on first, just to handle those, and then use another compression to do something else. So rather than using one compressor to try to handle those peaks, but also squeeze the overall vocal performance, you're going to end up messing up one to get the other. So for example, if we were going for an overall like squeezed vocal sound to kind of give us a tone, which is totally cool and what we want, but if we did that, and we'd had to bring the threshold way down to even start triggering those quieter parts of the vocal. And once we've done that, it's going to be so much overcompression on those louder parts that it's going to sound weird. So I'd rather set up this compressor to handle those peaks and another compressor that's just overall, after this compressor, that's just an overall tone shaping compressor. And that's what I'm going to do next. So there's a couple different ways to do tone compression. One is what I call butter compression. I don't know why. I grew up in Mississippi. Butter seemed like a good word to add to compression. And the other is more of an aggressive in-your-face compression. I don't use the butter compression tons on vocals, but sometimes I do if I just want a really smooth compression sound. Let me just show you what it is. I learned this from Kevin Ward. Probably works better with something like an SSL, like their bus compressor. But here's the settings anyway. Hang on, I don't want to change that one. Let me get another compressor in here. Boom. So here are the settings. Go with not a fast attack. So 50 millisecond attack and release. And what you do is you bring the threshold and the ratio all the way down. So the ratio is at 1:1, which means there's no compression happening, and the threshold is all the way down, which means as soon as there is audio present, it will be compressing. But since you've got a pretty slow attack and a relatively slow release, it's not going to immediately compress. Some of the transients are still going to come through, but it's going to be compressing the whole time. So it's just this smoother sounding compression. Doesn't go aggressive. It's just very smooth sounding. So what you do is you set it up like this and you hit play.
There is dark.
And nothing's happening, right? Because we haven't increased the ratio. So what you do here is you take the ratio and you just slowly bring it up. And you might be at 1.2:1 when you're starting to get, 3, 6, 9, 10 dB of gain reduction. Whatever looks and sounds about right is where you stop. And it's all kind of whatever pleases your ears. But it's a pretty cool, smooth sounding compression setting. And let's see what that sounds like.
There is darkness on the brightest day. And though there's beauty here, sin's black cloud remains. Here I'm a stranger.
So to me, that sounds pretty good. It's kind of squeezing the vocal. It's obviously made it a lot quieter. It's turned it down by about 7 or 8 dB. So we need to use the makeup gain. This is really important when using a compression. You want the before and after volumes to be roughly the same, so you can decide if you're making it better or just louder or quieter. If we take a look at the meter here, you can see this is the average level of the input right there, and this is the average level of the output. We want those, I love this compressor because it gives me both. We want those to be about the same. So I'm just going to increase the output gain until those white lines are dancing at roughly the same spot. It's not going to be exact, but you can actually do this without even listening. And what you'll find is the number here, the makeup gain, is going to be roughly what you're seeing in gain reduction. So 6 dB, and I'm getting about 7 dB or so of gain reduction. That should be about right. So when I unmute it and let you hear it.
There is darkness on the brightest day. And though there's beauty here, sin's black cloud remains.
So as you can tell, hopefully even through this, it's doing a tone thing. It's giving it that kind of squeezed, tightened vocal sound, but it's pretty smooth, and it just kind of, there's always some compression happening, a little bit more when she's louder, a little bit less when she's quieter, and the quietest parts are a good bit louder because we've got that makeup gain on. It's just a smooth sounding compressor. Problems, it brings up that sibilance like we said before, and it may be too much compression. Even though it's smooth, it might be too much, but it's certainly a type of compression that you can use. We definitely need to de-ess her voice. We'll get to that in a minute. The other option for compression, and I'll use the same compressor. You know what? I'll turn this one off, and I'll put another compressor just to have this for an example, is more aggressive in-your-face compression. So for that, hang on, move out of the way. Okay. For that, I like something more like fast attack, fast release, pretty high ratio, and then the threshold is more in the middle. I want it compressing most of the time, but not all the time. So for something like this, I'll go, 4:1 ratio, pretty quick. What did I say for attack? Like a 1 to 20 millisecond. Let's go 1 and just see kind of what it sounds like. I don't know if on a song like this, it's going to make as much sense because it's not an aggressive song, but it's worth showing to you because it could possibly give you kind of an example of what it sounds like. Okay, so here's the vocal coming through.
There is darkness on the brightest day. And though there's beauty here, sin's black cloud remains. Here I'm a stranger, but not for long. 'Cause where I'm going, I am known and loved, and I belong.
You hear how things like she says, and she's singing that really whispery quiet, but it's right in your face, and then she takes a breath, and the breath is really loud, and that's kind of what you're used to hearing in like a pop vocal.
Loved and I belong.
So it's got similar characteristics to the other compressor, but it's not compressing all the time as much. It's kind of hitting the bigger blobs of audio. The super peaks are still hitting that first compressor, and then the main blobs are hitting this one, and it can sound a little more aggressive. If we want to go crazy, we can go really high ratio and bring the threshold down a little more. If you want to get an example of what that sounds like.
Here I'm a stranger, but not for long. 'Cause where I'm going, I am known and loved, and I belong.
Hopefully we can all agree that is too much. Don't need to do it that much. So what I did is I actually had the same amount of compression, about 7 dB or so.
Here I'm a stranger, but not for long. 'Cause where I'm going, I am known and loved, and I belong. Oh, I am not okay.
So let's compare those two compressors, shall we? Let's pull up the vocal chain here. This first compressor is this second compressor here is the butter compressor. This is the aggressive one. Let's just do them real quickly. Here, I'll start with the butter, then I'll switch to the aggressive.
Here I'm a stranger, but not for long. Here I'm a stranger, but not for long.
Here, that just sounded a little more aggressive. It's probably a little bit louder. It's not a great A-B comparison, but we already covered A-B comparisons are stupid, so don't worry about them. Maybe a little too much compression on that one, but you get the idea. It's the same amount of compression, about 7 dB of gain reduction, but they do sound different. Are they wildly different? No, but they're just different. And one might be better appropriate. I encourage you to use both. There are tons of other ways to work on it, but yeah, those are the kind of the two go-to that I use for the most part on a vocal. Folks are asking about the knee setting on a compressor. It just has to, if you look at the settings, when I adjust the knee, it's adjusting that little bend in the way the compressor works, which just means if the knee is super low, it means the compressor does not kick in until the threshold is crossed. If the knee is more soft, you hear soft knee compression, it means down here below the threshold, there's some compression happening. And I think the way I understand it is like this is the 4-to-1 ratio up here. Down here, it might be like 1.5 to 1, 2 to 1, 3 to 1, and it's working its way up to the 4-to-1 compression as it approaches the threshold. That's the way I understand it. Honestly, I've never been able to hear much of a difference there, so I just kind of adjust it and pretend like I know what I'm doing. That make sense? All right, I've seen some questions come through. When would you use auto gain? I don't. PreSonus the auto gain used to be completely useless. Now I think it works well. I just like to do it by ear and visually. I like to see, here's the input, here's the output. I'm adjusting the output and I'm making it sound. When I bypass it, it sounds roughly the same volume. That's the way I like to work it. It's just more of a personal preference. If you can use auto gain, a lot of those auto gain things actually make it louder, which I think is not helpful. You've already set your level. You're not compressing to make it louder. You're compressing for tone and volume control, but you still want the basic, like average volume of that vocal to be about the same. Do you usually mix the vocals in solo or in context of the rest of the music? A little bit of both. For the most part, I might solo it just to find a couple of EQ spots that I was hearing in the mix. Then I'll drop it back in the mix and listen. So I realize in teaching this, it's not super helpful in the sense that you're not hearing it against the rest of the mix. At the same time, I don't find myself trying to fit the vocal in the mix. I just find myself trying to get a good vocal tone. So let's stick with the butter compression here, and let's just listen to it against our mix and see how we're doing.
Here I'm a stranger, but not for long. 'Cause where I'm going, I am known and loved, and I belong. Oh, I am not okay, but I wouldn't have it any other way.
Now, there's an example of when she sings, I wouldn't have it any other way. The other way is too quiet. But I don't think more compression is going to solve that problem. We could maybe get away with a little more compression to bring up those quieter parts, but that's probably going to be something we end up automating later to make sure we can hear it. So you can be lazy to a point, but if it gets to the point where you're over compressing everything to make those quieter notes louder, you've gone too far. Okay? Speaking of vocal automation, how's that for a segue? Love it. Vocal automation. So that's a great example. Let's just use that. Here's the chorus of this song.
Oh, I'm not
So overall, vocal might be a little just quiet there. Let's just turn it up. But their way. It's too quiet. You can't hear it. You don't know what she's saying, and it's an important line in the song. So we got to make sure that everyone hears it. Ideally, everyone hears every word. That's the idea. So if you're not a singer, pretend you're one for just a minute, because it can be helpful. Okay, so there are a couple ways to deal with vocal automation. I'm going to show you the way I like to do it first before I show you what you're expecting to see. So look at this vocal. Let's just humor me for a second, and let's just explore the idea that riding the volume fader with automation isn't always necessary or helpful. Look at this vocal. Just look at it visually. You got blob, 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 small blob. This blob here is a little quieter. What am I thinking right now? I said blob, blob, blob. Anybody? Any Arrested Development fans? Bob, blob, blah's law blog? Anyway. This one's a little quieter than these two. These two are pretty consistent. This one is way quieter just by looking at it. Let's see if that's true when we... Whoop, I made a mistake. Let's see if that's true when we listen.
But I wouldn't have it any other way.
She's singing her heart out. I don't mind this one, but this one is noticeably quieter. So what can you do? You can go in and you can adjust the volume of that spot, do volume automation, take the volume envelope and make it louder, or you can just do this. You just separate it. Wait, that's not it. Hang on. There was a button for that. Now I've lost my spot. Hang on, here we go. So you can just slice, all my presets are messed up. Okay, you can just slice it here and here, take this audio and just turn it up. You can literally, I am ashamed to admit this, I'll sometimes do this manually. I'll go watch a YouTube video and go through a vocal and do this until the blobs look more similar. And guess what? Here's what it sounds like. Now you tell me, here's what people will say. They'll say, oh, but Joe, you can't do that because you're changing the volume going into the compressor, and you don't want to do that because then the compressor's going to behave differently. And I'm thinking, okay, the compressor's job, one of its jobs, is to even out the volume. If I send the same volume into the compressor, what's it going to do? Even it out. So my thinking is, if I send more of a consistent volume into the compressor's not having to work in so many extremes, and it can give me just a pretty normal volume of compression. And what ends up happening, when she sings their way, it has roughly the same kind of compression characteristics as everything else, because now it's louder pre-compressor. That makes sense to me. There are people who will teach you the exact opposite. This just makes sense. Do whichever one makes sense to you. If you like writing volume, go for it. But for me, this is great because now I can go over to the mix window and I can move this volume fader all I want, and there's no automation there to mess up, right? If you've got automation on a vocal and then you go adjust the fader will jump back to where it was, because once you write automation anywhere, it's everywhere. All the volumes are now locked in place for all eternity, and I just don't like that. I like to save that for the end. So in the meantime, I do stuff like this, and in the context of the mix, now we hear her say other way, just very consistently. Doesn't sound weird, doesn't sound overcompressed. It just sounds like a normal person singing a song. Will that always be the solution? No, but I found more often than not, it's usually like chunks of phrases and different blobs that need the volume change. Now, if the person's singing like this note here.
Home.
So she sings out the word home. Maybe, I don't know if this is true, but perhaps this last part of that word gets lost because she's singing it quieter at the end. Yeah, you can't really hear her say at the end. That wouldn't work. Cutting that up and turning that up probably wouldn't work very well. That's a situation where going in and taking the volume and riding the volume, doing like normal volume automation, that's where that starts to make a little more sense. So, for example, let's just do that. Click on the fader. Now, your system is different. You got to learn how to do automation on your particular system. But this blue line represents the level of the vocal. And I'm clicking on it. I've got this engaged. I'm going to turn on touch automation, which means when I touch the fader, it's going to start writing something new. And I'm going to actually use my fader port down here that's controlling this fader. See how it moves like that? I'm going to use that to write a vocal automation here, okay? Let's do it. It's going to be great. Here we go. I even held my mouth open and everything. It's perfect. So now you got this.
Home.
So phrases where it's not really, there's not a clear dividing line from one phrase to the next, that's where I tend to use ride the volume on a vocal more often than not. But if I can get away with just different blobs and doing it that way, it works well. It also works for songs where the first verse, the vocal just needs to be quieter than the second verse and the third verse. You can do that with vocal automation, or you can just take the whole verse and bring it down in volume. And I've found more often than not that works pretty well and can be pretty cool. Now, the other side of this is I still think there's a place for riding the fader on a vocal. You may just want to, for example, here.
I've been broken since you left.
So something like since you left, I might want to bring it up a little bit for since and then kind of slowly bring it back down over you left. So let's do that real quick on this track. Let's go touch. Here we go.
I've been broken. I've been broken since you left.
Horrible automation job, but you get the idea. I boosted it up on broken and then since you left.
I've been broken since you left.
You could argue that can in broken, we could just slice it up and boost it. Absolutely, we'd get the same exact result. This way is faster if you get good at moving that fader around. If you are not good at moving that fader around, it'll take some practice. And it's definitely an art form. It's a performance. So if I do this in a mix, it's usually towards the end. And a lot of times I'm doing it on other tracks than vocals, but there's a place for it in the vocal. All the best mixers do tons of automation on the vocal, so I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I don't do it a ton, but when I do, it's very much at the end of the mix, if that makes sense. What button did you push to isolate the blob? I just sliced it on either side of the blob and then turned it up and down. All right. Let's talk about sibilance, because that's the next thing that's coming in. Right here. Let's say she says, since you left.
Since you left.
Okay. The S in since is really loud. That's a part of just the raw vocal is doing that, and then a part of it is the compressor is emphasizing that even more, so we got to take care of that. Now, if you have a de-esser plugin, use it. I don't have one. Studio One doesn't have an actual de-esser. What I've been using lately is, guess what? Another compressor. But I've been using it in a very specific way. So you may have seen a video I did on something similar recently on my YouTube channel. So what I'll do is I'll go nuts on the settings. So ratio all the way up, knee all the way down. This is going to be aggressive. Attack 1 millisecond. Release like 5 or 10 milliseconds. I want it to be quick and just bam. But then what is it listening to? I come down to this side chain thing right here. I don't know if you can see that. And I turn on the filter and I go listen filter. And then this is what the compressor is listening to.
Since you
So basically, I just adjust this low cut to where it's rolled off everything below like 6K. And really, the only thing you hear now is the S coming through. So now we can adjust the compressor to, it's only listening to those high frequencies, so it's only going to compress when the S's come through.
Since you left.
Now we just got to bring the threshold down until it's actually doing something.
Since you left. Since you left. Since you left.
That's too much.
Since you left. Since you left. Since you left.
Here's the before.
Since you left.
You hear how that S just chopped off your face? Here's the after.
Since you left.
Not as aggressive. It's pretty simple. You don't hear it very much, but now that S isn't bothering us as much as it was.
Since you left.
Now, a de-esser is literally, if you've never heard that before, it is is removing the S's in the sound. And different de-essers work different ways. You can use a multi-band compressor that is just compressing the upper frequencies. This is still compressing the entire frequency band. It's just listening to the upper frequencies, and that works out well. I've not seen a need to change that. It works fine. There are also de-essers that will do both. They'll give you the option of only compressing the high frequencies or compressing the entire band of frequencies, and you just listen to it. To me, you don't do it with your eyes. You bring it down until it is really sounding obvious, and the person almost starts to have a lisp, and then dial it back up. Don't go by what you see. You'll see a ton of gain reduction on the screen, and that might be okay if it sounds right. Always go off your sound. But I tend to try to err on the side of fairly controlled sibilance so that it doesn't chop my ears off, especially when I'm listening to something like on my earbuds where it can be really, really harsh. A couple other ways to deal with sibilance. An EQ notch can work. Lately, I've found that takes too much away. So if I put an EQ on here and let's turn off our de-esser for a second. And I find a frequency that's annoying. Oh, I'm so sorry. That was too much. And let's say I notch it out. It notches out that one frequency, but S's are kind of a huge range of frequencies. So by just notching out 7K, we've made it a little less harsh, but we've not really fixed the problem. It's the whole range of frequencies. So unless you're going to cut a bunch of those highs, which then you end up probably making it sound dull, and you don't want a dull vocal, that's why I tend to reach more for a de-esser there. Okay, we're in the home stretch. If you have any questions, let me know in the chat if you're here live. I want to hear what questions you have for me. De-esser is done in mastering anyway. I have not found that to be the case. You can, but a lot of times if you use a de-esser in mastering, it will actually trigger from the cymbals as much as the S's, depending on how the mix is. So you may end up not liking the result. Always do it on the vocal if you can. Unless that was a joke and I totally missed it. But we've covered a lot here. Obviously, there are combinations of these that we can use. We can use more than one compressor. Obviously, we have 4 compressors on here right now. Well, we're using 3. One is getting the peaks. One is the butter compressor. One we're not using, and one is acting as a de-esser. All of them have their pros and cons. If we used less compression on the first compressor, we might not need the de-esser now. And if we did different EQ, maybe different compression. So they're all adding on to one another. But this is kind of the approach that I usually take, and I just listen and listen and listen in context of the mix and make changes as I go. Studio One has a pre-made de-esser effects chain. I didn't know that. I believe it. They didn't always have that. Maybe they have it now. I'll definitely check it out. Snidley Whiplash, which is a great name, says he'll find the S's on the track and cut them like I was talking about cutting volume. That's a great option, and it sometimes can work perfectly. So S's, look at this. You can tell which ones are the S's. They're the really spiky looking ones. So you could literally just do this, and if I go cut off our de-esser, it is off. We can just take these down by 9 dB, boop, boop, boop. And that's a total legit way to do it too. Now you're only getting those. You're not messing with the high frequencies anywhere else. It gets tricky sometimes if there's like F's and T's and a couple other letters can jump through, and you can't just isolate them by themselves. Sometimes you can, but that's certainly a valid way of approaching it. Especially in a pinch. Sometimes there's just one line of a song where it sounds like they were just intentionally trying to just make the loudest S sound that they possibly could, and nothing you do with a de-esser is working. The simplest solution is almost always the best. So if that works on that specific section or an entire song, go for it. I'm not a big fan of going through and finding every S and bringing it down, because that's a lot of extra work. If I can set up a de-esser to do that for me and it works throughout the entire song, great. If not, then yeah, dive in and do some more. Spazzy said this would be a great song to mix in dueling mixes. We did mix one song off this EP called Sing Along back about a year ago. So go look in the back catalog of dueling mixes, and you can mix a song that is really awesome. A little more aggressive than this one. All right, I think I've answered most of the questions that I could. Let's talk about the vocal effects for a second, and what to use and when to use them and why to use them. So there aren't. You'll hear people say the right and wrong way to do things. There is, to me, there's the kind of the proper way to use things like reverb, but the rules are always meant to be broken in some way, as long as you understand the rule at first. So when thinking about the right way to use them, there are send effects and then there are insert effects. So send effects, I think about a mixing console. Back in the day, if I'm mixing through a big SSL board, I've got 2 reverbs in the rack, and I'm going to use an auxiliary send to send a little of the vocal, a little of the snare drum, a little of this guitar to that reverb, and that reverb's going to come back on a different set of channels, like a stereo, two channels on the console, and that's how I'm hearing the reverb. So I'm using auxiliary sends. That's the way typically we set them up in our system. So for example, if you look in my mix template, and I apologize, this is a little more busy than it should be, I've got a bunch of reverbs set up over here. A spring reverb, a plate reverb, a room reverb. They're just kind of there in my session on these auxiliary tracks, just waiting for me to send something to them. And so if I want some reverb on the vocal, I can say, you know what, let's see if that big honking plate reverb sounds good. What do you say? Let's try it.
So stop saying time can end.
It sounds amazing, right? No, of course not. Maybe the spring reverb with less of it.
So stop saying time can ever comfort me.
That's kind of cool. Maybe blended in the background sounds kind of cool. Same thing with delay. If I want her to have some sort of a slapback delay, well, no, let's do a slap delay. I've got all these delays already set up in my session. A slapback delay, a quarter note delay, a half note delay. They're already there, and I can just send from her voice to them.
So stop saying time can ever comfort me. Oh, I am not okay, but I wouldn't have.
Now, is that right for this mix? No, it's not. But it gives you the example. Those are how I would use send effects. Time-based effects like reverb and delay. It allows you to have separate control of each. I have the vocal sound here, and then I can adjust the sound of the delay somewhere else. Also, it allows me to send more than one track to that delay. Let's say there's a guitar that I want to slap back delay on as well. I can actually send it to that delay, and they're both just playing nicely together. Okay. Now, the other way of using effects is using it more like a pedal board. So instead of a console where you're sending out to an effect and bringing it back in, you think of it more like a guitar pedal board where you're using a reverb in line with everything else. You can certainly do that. I don't do it much with reverb, but I do use that quite a bit for things like distortion, a chorus, tremolo, things like that, where I want it on the entire track or I want a blend of it there. So for example, if there's an example, maybe there's a particular guitar track or a particular section of the vocal or well, let's just say the overall vocal, for some weird reason, we want to put like a tremolo effect on it. So we put it right there on the vocal.
So stop saying time can ever comfort me. Oh,
It's kind of cool.
I'm not okay.
So I've got it right on the vocal track after the compressors, and it's just there. And I can turn it on and off, different sections of the song, and it's right there. The entire vocal is going through it. If it has a blend knob or a mix knob on it, then I can use that to determine how much of the effect is in there, but it's on my overall vocal tone, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. If I wanted to have distortion on this vocal, I could use the red light distortion plugin, and I could make it really crunchy.
So stop saying time can ever.
And then I could bring the mix knob down and hear the dry vocal along with the distorted vocal.
So stop saying time can ever.
There's less control. I can't EQ just the distorted vocal, and the only way to control the balance between them is with this mix knob. So if I'm towards the end of the mix and I really just want to turn the distortion up, I can turn the mix knob up, but that might turn the dry vocal down and mess up my mix. So you may want to send to a bus that has the distortion on there versus putting it directly on your track. For me, it's a lot of times more really kind of over-the-top effects that I'll put in line on the channel itself, like a pedal board. Otherwise, I'm usually using send effects for a lot of those things that I'm doing. Another option is to just duplicate the vocal track and then do crazy stuff to it, and then just use the faders to blend them together. These are all legit options. For me, effects are kind of ancillary to the main point of what we're talking about here, which is the vocal mix, but the effects are kind of icing on top of an already good vocal sound. Does that make sense? So lots and lots more I could say about effects and how to use them and set them up. But that's kind of the way I like to approach them. And if you think about it in one of those two ways, okay, I want to use this effect, whatever it is. Does that need to be on the track itself, or does it need to be sent off and have its own separate but equal setting? That's the way I would approach it. Someone's asking about using reverb in parallel. I'm not sure what you mean by that, but you could certainly put a reverb plugin on the track itself. So this room reverb I've got, we can put it on the track and treat it just like that that distortion we had with a mix knob adjustment.
So stop saying time can ever comfort.
I hate working that way because I want to EQ the reverb and I want to adjust the amount being sent to it, and I don't want it in my vocal chain. I want them to be separate. Those are two that I just don't like to be together for some reason. Usually I feel the same way about delay as well. Any other questions here? We're kind of at the end. We've covered kind of everything I wanted to cover in this. EQ, compression, de-essers, a lot of the different EQ notching stuff, effects and how to set those up and different ways of setting them up. Obviously, we could go for days on, hey, check out this cool effect. But I don't want to keep you any longer because you've been here a while and I really appreciate it. But if you have any questions, hurry and type those in and I will answer those here as we round this out. And you know what? I'll answer those questions in just a second. Let me go ahead and talk about the very next thing. It's the last thing I want to talk about, and then we shall call it for this session. So all of this has kind of been the kind of core training behind a new course that I'm making called Vocal Mixing Guide. I've got a drum mixing guide. I've got a few other mixing courses, but I've not done one specifically on mixing vocals, and that's what this one is. So today was kind of like the seminar. You ever go to those classes in college where you have the seminar class where you sit and learn, and then you've got the lab where you go into the lab and you do the stuff you talked about? That's kind of how this course is. I made this part of the course free where we talked about all these concepts, and you can totally go do this on your own and make it work. But inside understanding or the vocal mixing guide, we're going to go in and get practical. I'm going to do like a walk-through mix of this vocal of this song, and then I'm going to do the same for two other songs, maybe one or two of my songs. And then there'll also be a bonus on mixing background vocals, because that's a whole different thing that we need to cover. There's even going to be a bonus on mixing a cappella vocals, which is just crazy to me. But I've got an a cappella track that turned out really well, and I'll share that with you. So if you ever get really... what's the word? You really want to back yourself into a corner and give yourself a challenge, a cappella can be really cool. So the course is not, as of this video, the course is not quite ready. When it is, it'll be at this link. If you follow this link, you can sign up to an email list, and I'll notify you as soon as it is ready. I was just working on it today. It's just not quite there. If you're watching this in the future, a week or two in the future, it will be available at this same link. Just go to understandingmixing.com/vocals, and you'll be able to access that, see if it's a good fit for you, and make some excellent vocal recordings and mixes. Not recordings, vocal mixes. That's what this whole thing's about. Okay, let me jump into your questions. Is there any use for things like Isotope Nectar or Kramer vocal plugin? Yeah, I mean, I'm showing the concepts. The tools you use, there's a bajillion out there. I've heard good things about Nectar. I've never used it, so I really don't know what it does. But if all you have is a basic EQ and a basic compressor, you can do just about everything I've shown you today, which is cool. Does that mean those tools are useless? No, not at all. But if you don't understand how to do it on the basic level, you're going to have a hard time doing it with other tools if you don't have the kind of the foundational concepts pretty rock solid. Is this song available somewhere? Yes, this is a song by Frankie Barranco. She is a wonderful musician and a great friend of mine. I actually produced this EP for her. It's called Still. It's a five-song EP. Go check it out. You can find her on Spotify, Apple Music, iTunes. Go look her up. I'll zoom in on her name so you can get the spelling. Frankie Barranco. Beautiful, beautiful project. Let's see. Not a mixing question, but how are you zooming in on stuff you're talking about? If you hold down Control on the Mac and then just scroll up and down with your mouse, it'll zoom in. Been doing that for years. How to EQ reverb. For me, I like to roll off everything below about 400 hertz. The thing about reverbs, a lot of them sound great, but they're really muddy if you send anything of substance to them. And so people don't use them because everything sounds muddy. If you EQ the reverb and remove the low end, suddenly you could send bass to it and it might be kind of cool because now you don't have all that extra low end muddying up your mix. Occasionally, I'll roll off the top end of the EQ. Of the reverb with an EQ if it's a little too harsh or sibilant, or like that spring reverb can be a little harsh in the upper mids. So I tend to cut that out a lot as well. You do amazing things with that Studio One compressor, my friend. Thank you, Joel. I've actually just recently gotten into using the fat channel compressors that they have, like the 1176 and the LA2A models, and they're great and they're very different sounding, and I really like them. So I think I've probably to a fault used stock plugins for so long to make a point, and you absolutely can make great mixes with them, but some tools make it easier. Some tools just have a vibe and a tone that you won't get with a stock plugin like what I've shown you today. But case in point, if you've listened to anything I've released and you like the mix, there's a good chance it was done with stock plugins, and the plugins are not the variable, I promise. DS after compression. Good question. Usually, it depends. I think de-essing first is typically a good idea because it is a subtractive tool. So in this instance, I would still do everything in the order that we talked about, but then I would test putting that de-esser first in the chain. If it doesn't sound right and it's not working, it may work better to do it after the compressor because it's enhanced and it's very loud and obvious. It might be easier to take care of. But that's what's so great about a digital system like this. You can just drag it and change the order as much as you want and see which one sounds better. You don't have to repatch anything. It's not annoying at all. So it's probably, for me, 80% of the time it's early in the chain, but occasionally it's last, especially if it's right at the end of a mix and I just hear, you know what, that just needs a little de-esser. I'll throw it on at the end because I don't want it to change how everything else is working. I love what's happening between the interaction of the EQ and the compressors and whatever else is on the track. So I'm going to put something right at the end just to make a few changes. I'll do the same thing with an EQ. I'll put another EQ on at the end just to make an overall tonal change that might need to happen as a final mix tweak versus going in and changing the EQ. That will then change how the compressor after it functions, which can change how the next compressor functions, and the mix could very well fall apart pretty quickly. Gary Fox, thanks for being here, my friend. Jared says, send tracks versus insert is basically about control of the effect then. Yes, absolutely. If it's one of those things like in a guitar pedal board, I like to have delays on, but I have a blend of them. And I dial in that blend, and I love the way that it sounds. If you can do that, great. But if you don't love the way that it sounds, or you want a very specific delay that's on a specific, a quarter note delay that's every quarter note and it's very scientific, then maybe I'll record the guitar without the delay and then I'll add the delay in the system. And if I want to be able to EQ that delay and change the level of the delay and have it come on and off depending on the section of the song, all of that works easier if it's on its own separate track and you're sending over to it versus having it blended in the same track and you're turning a plugin on and off, which may mess with your levels and things like that. Good question, though. Folks are saying thank you. The course, this is cool. You'll see when you click the link, it'll be very affordable. I'm actually going to try something a little bit new. I'm not going to say in the video because the pricing can always change, but you'll see it when it's out. It'll be very affordable, and there'll be an option to make it stupid affordable. And I don't take stupid affordable lightly. How do you know what effects to use on vocals after the dry recording? Fred, that's a fabulous question. For me, a lot of it comes down to listening to other music. So what is being released and what does it sound like? And what I'm looking over here, and the camera's over here. What's being released right now? What are your favorite albums that just came out? And how do those vocals sound? Foo Fighters, great example. The song "The Sky Is a Neighborhood." This album just came out, Concrete and Gold. It sounds literally like he's singing in the middle of a room over there. Probably just a reverb effect with the mix knob way up, which totally goes against everything I just said about reverb, but it's a cool effect for the song, so totally do it. That's just different and interesting. Are there lots of delays in the songs you hear? Are they obvious? Are they subtle? Is there distortion? Does the vocal have this like raspiness that you don't get from a compressor, but it's actually like a distorted sound? Well, if that's the case, you got to figure out how to blend in some distorted sound into your sound to get that, to accomplish that. But more often than not, you'll find, I mean, lately in the last few years or so, people are using more and more reverb, especially in like independent stuff. But then a really dry vocal can still be very compelling. So I would say don't do anything by default. Do everything you do on purpose and have a reason. And better yet, if you can, have an example in your head of someone else who's done that before and it's worked well. What I hear a lot with people is they just they're maybe new to mixing and they just fall in love with this idea of putting themselves in a cathedral every time they sing. And it doesn't sound good, right? There's almost never a case where that sounds good. But they'll have their little acoustic guitar track and their drums and their bass, and then their vocal will just be drowning in reverb. And go show me another professional mix that has that, and I might listen to you. But otherwise, you're just not going to find that. That's too much. So err on the side of subtlety, err on the side of doing what someone else has done or a variation of that, because that's what art is, right? Every jazz musician is ripping off 10 other jazz musicians when they play their solo, right? They stole this lick from Dizzy Gillespie and this hit from Miles Davis, and they're making it into their own, and it's still very much art. That is what art is. So it's not that you're ripping somebody off and you have to do your own completely unique sound, because you're going to combine the sounds in a way that no one has before. But I would encourage you, especially when you're starting out, there are people who know more than you, who are more successful than you, so follow in their example and do some of the things they do, and don't step too far outside of that box unless you have a really good, compelling reason. Let's see if there are any other questions I need to knock out. Time-based vocals always sends? Almost always, yes. So reverb delay, I almost always do a send for that. For reasons like in this song, in the actual mix of this song, when she sings, I think when she sings the chorus, oh, I think I had a really soft, like, quarter note delay go, oh, I am not okay. And just very subtle in the background. That's something I do quite a bit, but it's back there. It's not super obvious. But what I'll do is I'll use that as a send, and I can automate the send on the vocal on and off. So just like you can automate volume, I can turn this on and off in different sections so that there's slap delay on this one section and not on this section. Just this one word has delay on it and not the others. It's just the best, most efficient way to do it, and I'm a sucker for doing things efficiently. What compressor do you recommend in vocal mixing? I really like anything that sounds like an 1176 right now. So for example, PreSonus, this is going to date this video if you're watching it 2 years in the future, and they don't have this anymore, but in their FAT channel, they've rolled out this compressor, which is FET Comp. It's like an 1176. If you need aggressive, it does aggressive really well. Kind of the same settings I showed you earlier in the video of the settings for aggressive compression, but then the actual compressor itself just has a certain vibe to it on top of the technical stuff that it's doing that I really, really like. What's your experience with tube condenser mics versus normal condensers? I've used them. I've had them. I'm not in love with them. I think just it's more important for me to find a mic that's right for the voice, or a mic that works well on a lot of sources. We're in home studios. We're not going to have 17 different microphones for a vocal. Right now, I've got a vocal session tomorrow, and I think really I'm going to set up one microphone. I've really got one, the Roswell Mini K47 that we used on Frankie's voice, and I've used on my voice the last few EPs that I've done. I really like it, so I'm just going to use it. It's not a tube. I just think the presence of a tube isn't what makes it great, but there are a lot of great mics that are tube. Tube also can, as far as maintenance goes, I wouldn't know how to fix one if it broke, and they tend to, I think I may be wrong about this, but it seems like there's more things to go wrong with a tube mic. I could be totally wrong, and I'm certainly not against them. I haven't had a tube mic in a long time. Do you recommend using a separate reverb alone for vocals and separate it from the reverb on other instruments? No, I don't, but as you can see in my template, I've got three different reverbs set up. I almost never use all three. Usually I just use one. So I may send the vocal to the spring reverb and the drums to the room reverb and a crazy guitar to the really long plate reverb. But it's not about any sort of theoretical thing. It's just literally, I think, these drums would sound good with the room reverb. That guitar would sound great through that plate reverb. this vocal would sound really cool through the spring reverb. I'm not thinking about conceptually trying to put them all in the same space. I don't care. I just want it to sound cool, and that's what I do. You know what? I think I'm going to call it. Do you have any videos on tracking vocals and how you go about it? I do have a course on, it's called Recording Killer Vocals. I talked about it at the beginning. It's at understandingrecording.com/vocals. Pretty cool course. Goes through different microphones and different approaches and different miking techniques and all that. Super fun. You should check it out. It is a paid course, though. And I'm sure I've got some videos on YouTube. Just go search my channel. There might be some in there as well. People are asking to talk about mic technique, and the answer is no. This is a vocal mixing video. Mic technique is recording, and that's not the topic for today. So you'll have to wait for another day or check out that Recording Killer Vocals course that I just mentioned. All right, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thanks so much for being here. Those of you here live on the chat, really appreciate you being here, giving me someone to talk to, so I'm not just talking to my computer in complete isolation. If you're watching this in the future, thank you for watching this as well and sticking around. I know this is a longer video. I would encourage you to please check out the vocal mixing guide. I think it would be very helpful for you. There should be information and a video on that page when it is available for sale, or if it's not available just yet, you can sign up and I'll send you an email once it is. But that's gonna call it a day for me. This has been good. My voice is tired, which means I think I've talked enough. So thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna wrap it up, and I'll see you around later.